this is for anyone who sees this in the future, this is a super impromptu, off-the-cuff replacement talk about Gatsby. That's the title of this. Yeah, in general, I can tailor this to whatever we want to talk about. I have some experience and some opinions about Gatsby and how it works with Drupal, but what was everybody here for and most interested in? Did you just want to learn about, in general, how Gatsby works, how it works with Drupal? What? In general? Okay, cool.
Plus Drupal.
Plus Drupal. All right. So, the in general. So, I can tell you guys how I learned Gatsby initially. I mean, as far as like where to jump in and learn, their tutorial is really great. But what it took me through is they have a number of starter kits, and the tutorial uses a starter kit and teaches you how to use data from the file system as markdown files to do a static build of a site. But the other thing that definitely makes Gatsby interesting initially when I was starting to learn it is how fast it actually is. And let me see if they have a good starter example. So they have a bunch of starters. So this could be a starting point, like if you wanted to build a blog with Gatsby, or a regular site, or have a different data source. But blog's a decent example. That's the repo. So at the end of the day, Gatsby is a static site generator that's based in React. So it does a full static build of your site, but you can still, if you are familiar with React, you can still build with React components. You can still do the fancy single page app things that you might want to do with React on top of what you build out of Gatsby. But also, last weekend, and also on podcasts and good things like that, I've heard Kyle, the project lead of Gatsby, talk about what Gatsby is from his perspective. And the project's focus is definitely on performance. So trying to make a build that by default is fast and that you have to work kind of hard to make not fast. It certainly is possible to make a Gatsby site that isn't fast. But so if you haven't actually looked at a Gatsby site and clicked around, that experience is what made it really compelling to me. So if I take one of these blog posts and click on it, it just loads instantly. And how it actually does that behind the scenes is it's, I think the phrase for it is the purple pattern, but it does a lot of smart preloading. So it's actually going to, based on the page that I'm on right now, know that I'm most likely going to click on, I would guess, probably all of these links, and start to preload the necessary data and assets for that, so that when I click on it, it's instantaneous. And that is really awesome. In fact, sometimes for me, it's so fast that it feels kind of weird. But I have the least important site on the internet. My personal website is also a Gatsby site. And I was on vacation recently and didn't recover back to blogging. But so even I have a bunch of different posts here, and I have pagination, and I'm paginating through all the posts on my site, and it just all kind of comes up immediately. If I go back to the front here, so there's some cool image handling plugins where the image here is a responsive image. So during the build, Gatsby takes the image, creates a local version of the file, and then generates the image at different responsive sizes. And then also there's an effect that's applied to it. So you see that it does that little scale up effect there that's popular in Medium and Facebook. And then this site specifically, we can talk a little bit more about how that happens, and that's where we can get into some actual slides. But because I'm also a Drupal guy and very interested in Drupal and how Drupal works together with other technologies, this is all talking to a Drupal instance, a Contenta install. So all the data is just from a handful of post nodes that I have. So whenever I want to spin up a build here, so there is a couple commands. I can probably just run them. I can try to show you what the actual development experience looks like a little bit. So this is a repo for my site. It's up on GitHub, but I have kind of everything together, Drupal, Gatsby. But if I run, we'll see how the internet likes me. If I run Gatsby develop, it's going to do a build of my Gatsby site. So it's going to go talk to Drupal if it can, and then go through all my content and create a static build. Maybe this isn't going to work out with the conference internet. But when you do that, it spins up a little dev server, and you can go look at your site. And as you make changes in your components, they'll be live reloaded and up to date, just similar to like a React app that you bootstrap with Create React app. The one thing that at least, oh, here we go, we got something. At least I don't have set up. This might just be a limitation of the plugin, but I haven't found a way to work around. Like if I actually want to import new data, I have to run the Gatsby develop again. And then when you actually want to deploy this somewhere, you can just run Gatsby build, and it starts a build process and creates a completely static bundle of your entire site. And you can host that pretty much anywhere. My site right now is on GitHub Pages, for example. So I just commit the result and push it up to GitHub Pages, and there it is. So it looks like I do have the dev site up here. Yep. This was actually at Decoupled Drupal Days last weekend. So I have an example post from that presentation. But it just pulls in the latest data from Drupal and shows me the dev server. I can do things like, so if I look in Gatsby here and in my source, I probably to being not necessarily prepared and not having enough time. I don't know if we'll be able to get too deep into the actual structure of some of these components, but for a lot of the content that's on the main page there's a handful of different post types. And at the end of the day, these templates are really just React components. But I guess the other thing that I haven't really talked about that is an important piece of Gatsby is that you get all of your data through GraphQL. So you write a GraphQL query in your component like we see here. So this is for a single post type. And if you have not done anything with GraphQL, this will look weird to you. That's fine. It looked weird to me as well. But that just lets you write a query to get all the data for this template, this particular post. And we can look at some of the tools that it offers as far as creating GraphQL queries. But we also have just the React JSS markup for the post, and I can try to go here and say hi GovCon, add that, and you'll see that it notices the change, picks that up, recompiles, and we should have, but we don't. Yeah, I would expect that to have shown up in the template here, but completely unplanned live demo fail for some reason. Yeah, right? But that's the basic idea there. And then, so as far as like creating your GraphQL queries, Who has used GraphQL before? A couple people, 3 people. Cool. I was new to it when I was trying to learn Gatsby, but there is a really cool tool that's bundled with it, and there's also some GraphQL modules for Drupal that I believe also have this packaged together with it. It's called GraphQL, which is a query UI that lets you write some GraphQL queries. And so this you can use to experiment and try to get the data that you need. It has some nice like auto-suggest. So I think if I hit space, I can start constructing my GraphQL query here. So I can do all site, all node post. My data in this case comes from Drupal in post nodes. And then I can keep, auto-suggesting and find the things that I need. I am also not super skilled with GraphQL, but node. And then you get to the point where you do have to understand the structure a little bit and what the Gatsby source Drupal plugin gives you. But you can start to get to things like the node ID or the body field. So I'll do the body. And then run your query, and then you see the results that you get back. And that's the object that you're going to have access to in your particular Gatsby templates. And then even if you were using like a data source like Markdown, so there's a pretty big plugin ecosystem. And so you can there's plugins for dealing with Markdown data, which is really common. Even like JSON data or just files from the file system. But still all of that data, you're going to write at the end of the day GraphQL queries to be able to make that data available to your template. So for me, it was definitely just a different way of looking at things, but the GraphQL in general, the idea that you have the power on the front end and in your template to define the data that you need and the query that you need to get at the data is a pretty cool way of thinking of things. Any questions at this point? I can talk a little bit more about the Gatsby source Drupal plugin, but I'm sure there must be questions. Maybe not. Yeah.
Where are you running? So the plugin or the module, the Gatsby integration module, does that handle the GraphQL queries, or do you have to? How are you getting the GraphQL queries?
Yeah. Let me jump over and talk about that then. I didn't want to, if there were any general questions, I wanted to cover those first, but I can talk about that. And also, just to, again, take the opportunity, maybe I'll do it again. Sorry for what is probably a pretty crappy overview of Gatsby on this video, but hopefully it still gets people interested. Okay, so I can jump into some slides somewhere. Yep, that's Kevin's site. All right, let me just do this then.
Brian, did you already just talk about why people want to use Gatsby?
Yeah, I did, but probably not super well. But from my perspective, it's because the sites are like blazingly, incredibly fast. They describe themselves as like a blazingly fast static site generator. And also, if you like working in React, it's really attractive. Yeah.
Is there any way to convert an entire Drupal site into a static site, something like that using Gatsby?
Yeah, so taking the Drupal data and making it a static site?
Correct.
Yep. Yeah, so we'll dive into the plugin. I got a little confused because I lost track of my slides, but I will open them up, and we'll talk specifically about that. And then we might also even be able to talk about some other ways that you can make a static build out of your Drupal site. But so this talk was specifically about my experience with the Gatsby Drupal plugin, and the short story kind of is that I feel like Gatsby's gaining steam in the Drupal community, but not enough people are really putting this plugin specifically through its paces. And there's a lot of like tutorials and blog posts about using Gatsby with Drupal, but it basically gets to the point where you have just like the titles of 5 nodes, and then you're done. You did it. Again, there are a lot of plugins that exist for Gatsby, which is great because you can take the plugin and add new functionality as you need it to your site. But this is the Gatsby source Drupal plugin, and it works with a Drupal site that has JSON API enabled. So there's some config that you need to add to your Gatsby config.js that basically tells you just where the site is, and if you have a different endpoint for your API, you have to tell it where it is. But then really what it does, and there are potentially some performance challenges with this, but it actually just crawls all the available endpoints that are exposed through JSON API and just gets all of your data. Kyle, the Gatsby project lead, was at a couple dev days last weekend, and he even, in talking to him, kind of described it as like a copy of your entire site. But it really does. It crawls the API, gets all the data that that Drupal has, and then it is available in the GraphQL schema. So it does make some assumptions about the structure, like there's a relationships part of the object, and things like file references or image references will be under relationships, but it handles entity references. It also will, for an image, if it knows that it has an image field, it will actually create a local copy of that image so that it can include it in the build, because you don't want to be pointing at the images on your CMS, because the idea here is that you could spin up a build, turn Drupal off, but still have your website based on your Drupal data. So this is certainly one way to create a completely static build of a Drupal site. You have to want to build your site in React, but I think you will know in your heart of hearts whether or not that is for you. I've been using this on my site for about a year. I'll breeze through some of these things, but I talked about the tutorials a little bit, and that I feel like those don't quite deep dive enough, but I've seen a lot of folks that I know in the Drupal community who are using Gatsby not use the Drupal plugin and use Markdown as a data source instead, so I was kind of wondering why that would be the case. And I've heard a lot of talk about projects that use Gatsby and Drupal, but not a lot of really specific concrete examples. There were a few that did come up at Decoupled Drupal days last weekend. Drupal Commerce has a decoupled prototype that uses Gatsby. They specifically talked about running into some performance problems. And then there was outrider.org, which is a really nice static Gatsby site, but they're actually not using the Gatsby source Drupal plugin. The Decoupled Days website actually is, and the way that they layered it on I thought was pretty interesting, and then I think they started with just a regular Gatsby site, and then got to the point where their content needs, when they had all the sessions that they needed to post, it made sense for them to have that stuff in Drupal and point their Gatsby site at that as a data source. I think they submitted a talk specifically about that to Badcamp. I'm hoping that they end up presenting that. I'll skip over this. I did some kind of an informal discussion on Twitter and Slack about who's using this, but a bit of a tangent, but the last one, if you're particularly interested in the front row there about other ways that you could do a static site build with Drupal, there's another recent project, Tome, which I always want to say Tome, like Marissa Tomei, but that's not how you say it. And that is a Drupal project that lets you create a static build of your Drupal site. So literally just what Drupal would render, it just spits out a static build of that. So if you're interested in static builds, that's also a really interesting project to check out. And then, as I kind of wondered about why people might not be using this plugin as much as I expected, I wonder if people are starting with the Markdown approach and tutorials, and then either that's fine for them, or using Drupal might be overkill, but they're having a little trouble getting over the hump. And I think that'll balance out over time, but there's some things that we can do to make it easier. So I don't know if I'm going to go all the way into this, but the examples that I use to kind of illustrate this is image handling. And I think that actually using images from your Drupal data is an example of where this is maybe a little harder than people might expect, at least to get started. I'll give kind of the short overview of this, but when I wanted to add this to my site, I looked at the plugins, and the first one I found was the Gatsby Remark images. But Remark in that case is a markdown processing library, so that means it's not going to work with your Drupal data. But they have a more generic Gatsby image plugin, which can do all those image effects that we looked at before. Really the hard part was kind of understanding the structure of the GraphQL query that I needed to use. There's a few things specific to the plugin where you need to define the type of responsive image you want to generate and the max width of it, for example. And that thing with the 3 dots is a query fragment, I believe. I just hadn't used that before. So just took a little bit of work. But then you can include the responsive image here in your JSX. And that gives you the nice scaled up image and everything. But then that got me to the point where I just had one single image that was placed explicitly in my post template. It was always going to be at the top, and then all the body content was going to be below it. And I won't go deep into this because it's a little bit of a hack to work around it. But I asked myself, was there a way that we could flexibly place the image in our content? The real answer is there really isn't a way to do that, and that might be a good opportunity for another supporting plugin in the Gatsby ecosystem for this. What I ended up doing was a bit of a hack where I put a placeholder in my Drupal data for the React component, that post image there. And then there's a React module, React HTML parser, and that gets the, in this case, the data from the body field and parses it into the equivalent React components for your HTML elements, but also has this transform function. Yeah. So I look for that post image placeholder, and then when I see it, I replace it with the actual post image component, and that lets me put the image anywhere in the post. It's hacky, but interesting that it's at least possible. But that's probably an example of something that I think people might expect to be possible or easier. And if you're using Drupal as your CMS, you maybe want the ability to have more flexibility over where you put some of your image content. And it's harder than you might think. And then one other thing that I can do, and then I can yield over to you, is so that gets me to the point where I have this Gatsby site that looks at Drupal, but if I update a Drupal node, nothing happens. And I've got to go launch a build, and then commit the result and push it. There's definitely a lot of ways to automate that. You can write hooks to handle that. One thing that I did, just because I like Netlify as a host and plan on migrating my site over to it, I just created a really simple module. Netlify does a lot of great static hosting, and they have webhooks. So you can ping a webhook, and basically just what happens is when an entity updates here, it pings a Netlify webhook that you've configured, and it will just automatically launch your build. And you can configure it so that it will either just go to production, or it would create a staging build that you can look at and promote up. So just that little tweak there, I think, makes it even nicer to do this, and that I don't have to do any sort of manual build process. Yeah.
Can I just get you to hum 2 more tunes about that?
Yeah, sure. Are you planning on do you want to have your 10 minutes?
Yeah.
All right, cool, yeah. I'll talk about that, because I think the easiest way would be to demo it. I don't know if the videos for Decoupled Drupal days are up yet, but I do demo it in that. But the basic idea is, so when I save a node, Netlify basically it specializes in static site hosting, so it can essentially run any build steps that you want for a node package. I think it also can recognize if it's a Gatsby project. But really all that happens is it just has a URL that you can post to. And if you post to it, it just runs whatever build command you specify in its configuration options. So if I post to it, it just runs Gatsby build in my repository.
So can I just say back to you what I think you're getting at?
Yeah, I'm probably doing a terrible job, but yeah.
So if you've got a decoupled Drupal setup and you're using Gatsby, you update your content on the backend, which no one in the world can see.
Yep.
And then that triggers a webhook, and then Netlify knows to grab the new static JSON and then rebuild the HTML.
Yep, exactly. It's going to start the build process, so it talks to Drupal, gets all the updated data, and then does a Gatsby build, and then the asset shows up in the public folder, which it knows to deploy. Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it makes this process a lot easier. And also, this is in no way specific to Gatsby. Anything that you might want to host on Netlify could take this approach. And yeah, I'm hoping to add some more functionality to this, and so definitely check it out.
What are you using it for?
My Gatsby site.
Your Gatsby site. Does it work the way I just described?
Yep.
Cool.
Is there any kind of delay? What's the delay between content update and like the default backend and?
Yeah. So my site isn't even on the most recent Gatsby version. I think that would help a little bit, but it's I have like 50 posts, 2 minutes.
That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. And then the Gatsby folks are specifically working on improving the build time and like a preview service, so they're also trying to approach that problem too. Yeah.
Have you done any benchmarking of, like the cached Drupal page running the same preloading that Gatsby's doing and an actual Gatsby build to see what the time savings is?
For the entire build?
No, like for loading a page, that's cached out of Drupal versus one that's in Gatsby.
The way that it preloads things past the initial load, it gets to the point where it, I haven't done actual benchmarking, and I'd be interested in doing that, but the really interesting thing for me is like the actual feel of it, and it literally does feel like every single thing you click on is instantaneous, because it has actually already loaded the stuff. If anybody wants to talk more or ask questions, we can definitely do after this, but I want to make sure I give you some time. So, and thanks for listening.
That's an amazing one.
I know, yeah. Very impressive. Can I make a plug for the Tome project while you guys are switching places?
I'm the CEO of Kalamuna, and we've been working on static site problems for about 3.5 years. We were very interested in a couple different things that are, I think, a little bit disparate, but because of our approach, have been merged from the beginning, and that is style guiding, prototyping, and static site generation. Those things have typically been separate or isolated from one another in different initiatives. And what we wanted to do was create a tool that would build a solid pipeline from prototyping with the versatility of being able to go static or deciding later what kind of backend we wanted to plug into our experience. More practically, I'm just going to give you a little tour of what it looks like in practice, in production. Here's the backend of a site that gives us a style guide. Now, at the time when we started this, Pattern Lab was like in 1.0, and you couldn't produce any production-ready code from it. So that was a requirement that we had, and why we sort of rolled our own at the time. And it was really opinionated in how you organized all the stuff. So you've got all your components or whatever, but then you can take all the components, put them together, and create prototypes. And so we did this website recently called La Prose, which is an exhibition website for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. We started this, they had a Drupal backend that was all built in paragraphs. In the front end, they were just kind of starting to hit some limits on what they could do on the front end. And because it was such a front-end heavy experience, redoing the whole thing in Drupal didn't seem to make sense. So we built it all up as a prototype, and then we didn't even get to doing any of the Drupal stuff because we were just able to launch the prototype as the real website. We launched it on Netlify, and it's on the free tier. We're not even paying any money for this, or their client's not even paying any money for this, and this is an institution. They get tens and hundreds of thousands of people visiting the site, and it's working super, super zippy. Now, okay, well, we built this one off, but then once they start to have more exhibitions and they want to be able to do like more and more pages, they're going to need to manage this content in some way. But we're figuring it out later. And this was the flexibility. We didn't even need to really figure out ahead of time like what backend system we were going to be using. because we've got a static site. We can pull the content in from anywhere. Right now, it's all through Markdown files. But we're working on and have prototypes and integration with a couple other systems. One is with Prismic. We got working pretty well. But we're going to be investing a little bit more in gather content to pull a JSON feed from there. We've also had this working with Drupal 6, Drupal 7, and Drupal 8. Most specifically Drupal 8, but Drupal 7 just on the prototyping side of things. Yes, sir.
Just a real quick question. So, I mean, you talked about the Drupal 8 content being in paragraphs. Was that the big obstacle that you couldn't get that content or that data source working with your static site?
Oh no, that's not a problem. So the way that we set things up, our Twig templates are shared across the Drupal landscape and the prototype.
Okay.
So that sped things up. We wrote a little module at the time for Drupal 7 integration called Twig Shim, which would load Twig templates in Drupal 7. And we did that at a time when D8 was like uncertain still. People were thinking about migrating, so we could decouple the front end and then reuse a lot of those templates later in an 8 migration. So the problem really wasn't like having those things integrate, but then you have to build a service, right? In Drupal 8, you're creating your own like schemas and everything. You're adding a bunch of weight. But the hang up for a really strong front end experience was that they decide they want to do some new thing, some new library. They have to find a way to make it work with Drupal and then find a way to make it work on the front end. There's like all of this weight when really it's mostly just words, contents, buttons, whatever, right? Check it out if you're interested. It's all open source and on GitHub. It's called Calistatic, and there's a bunch of other companion modules. And we use this to power our website. It will produce not only prototypes, but like a complete website. It's not quite as fast in some ways as Gatsby. But I've also discovered, this is another problem with static websites, is that images, we're recreating the wheel in a bunch of ways. And images are hard. So anyways, I found there's a whole bunch of these different services, but that do these kind of like image cache things for your static images. So we're starting to play around with that. And that's super nifty. It's a problem if you're putting a static website together. Suddenly, like everyone needs to have Photoshop and crop images again, and you're just like, So here you can take an image stored anywhere, and then through their API, like scale it and do different things and reposition it. So it's kind of like an interesting approach to a really common problem. This service I happen to like because you just put the full URL in, and then it will go and fetch the image wherever it is. So you don't even have to deal with like managing all of those images. They can just exist anywhere. Anyways, this is like really quick. A lot of the things we're doing. Check it out. Insights.famisf.org. It's a static website.